Hey everybody, are you ready to do radio chapter 5? So we talked about sound and music in the previous unit, so now we're going to talk about how that was converged onto this new technology, radio. So 232 million people still listen to the radio every day. And so I want you to think about how radio is different than other media that we consume. Typically, it's a secondary activity, meaning that we're doing something else while we are listening to the radio, typically like driving or cooking or homework or something. So it's very rare that we sit next to a radio and just listen to it the way that our great-great-grandparents did in the 20s and 30s. Do we still listen to the radio? And this, we're talking about terrestrial radio here, not satellite radio. Terrestrial radio, meaning the radio stations that are local and have antennas. I do, mainly during bad weather, but lately I've just been going to Twitter instead. And I always listen to the baseball games when we actually have baseball games. All right, so what do you think? And this is what we're going to talk about in class. Do you still listen? What do you like about the radio? What are your dislikes? Do you listen to ground radio or do you stream? How do you use the radio? And more importantly, how does the radio use you? So get excited. Let's start with the basics. James Maxwell was a physicist in the 1860s, and he discovered this little sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum where you can transmit sounds. So here's the electromagnetic spectrum, and you see like gamma rays, X-rays, UV rays, etc. And then that little sliver is just the visible light. Then if you see where it says radio, those are all the frequencies that radio signals can be sent through. So Marconi is credited with inventing the radio. He took the radio waves from Maxwell's electromagnetic spectrum, figured out how to transmit Morse code on them. Now, early radios were actually called Marconis, but his view of the radio was just one-to-one. His view of the radio was more like a walkie-talkie. Okay, so you're just sending a message to one other person. He received a patent on that, and he thought of radio mainly just as walkie-talkies, just one-to-one. Now, it changed with Emile de Forest because he figured out how to put music and voice in those radio waves. He called himself the father of radio. He sounds very humble, but he changed the idea from radio for one person to broadcasting. Okay, and it's interesting too, there are stories about homes where they had radios for the first time. People thought the houses were haunted because they had never heard voices in their homes that didn't belong to someone in their family. So the broadcasting term is actually a farming term where you would go out in the field and you would strew the seeds as far as you could. You would broadcast them. And radio was the first medium to really do that, to reach many people at once electronically. So if we have a new medium, then of course the government wants to regulate it. There's a couple laws that you want to be familiar with from this chapter. The Radio Act of 1912 said that radio stations had to have a license, and the reason that they did that is that the airwaves were getting too crowded. You had too many radio stations trying to operate at the same frequency. Okay, so you needed a license to operate at your particular frequency on the radio dial. And the Radio Act of 1912 also said that radio waves could not be owned. Now, the stations that transmit messages through the waves can be owned, but the airwaves themselves actually belong to the public. So during World War I, it was really interesting. The government actually cut down on the use of ham radios because they were worried that they were being used for espionage with the Germans. The first station to sell commercials was WNBC in New York. An ad was $50. You can imagine that the public reaction was not good. But remember, radio exists to make money. So let's talk about David Sarnoff. He was Marconi's message boy, okay, at age 15. Listen to this quote. I have in mind a plan which would make radio a household utility the same sense as the piano or the phonograph. The idea is to bring music into the house by wireless. He said that when he was 24. And this quote reminds me a lot of what Bill Gates was saying about the personal computer in the early 80s, that he had this vision that every home would have one. And David Sarnoff had that same vision about the radio. He went on to create a little company called National Broadcasting Corporation, which we know now as NBC. But one of the biggest things he did was that he had the idea with General Motors to put radios in cars. So my dad is older, and he tells the stories that when you had a car with a radio in it, you always drove around with the windows down so that everyone knew you had a radio in your car. It was a big deal. All right. So here's another law you want to know. This is the Radio Act of 1927. Remember, station owners didn't own the airwaves, they just had the licenses. But this law said stations had to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. So if you're ever listening to a terrestrial radio station and they have to do like an emergency broadcast test or something like that, that's what they're doing. They're fulfilling their public interest, convenience, and necessity that's legislated by the Radio Act of 1927. Now, how do you define it? Because you know shock jocks tend to get in trouble sometimes because of the things they do. They get fined by the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, because they don't operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. It's vague. It's vague. But you want to make sure you know that the Radio Act of 1912 said that stations had to have a license to operate, and the Radio Act of 1927 said that stations had to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. So the golden age of radio is the 30s and 40s. Why? Well, it's easy. There's no competition. You know, there was no television yet. And so this is when people would literally sit next to the radio and listen to soap operas. A lot of the soap operas that were really successful television shows actually started as radio serial programs. S-E-R-I-A-L, meaning coming in episodes. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, who was president through most of the 40s, well, no, not most of the 40s, but he was president for ages, 12 years, I think. He was the first one to use this new medium, radio, to speak directly to the American public. So before, the president would have to speak to reporters, and then they would tell the story of whatever the president said. Okay, they were the middlemen. Well, here is a president using a new medium to speak directly to the public without any reporters or media people involved. He did this, he got a lot of flack for this, which reminds me of the flack that President Trump gets for using Twitter. It's the same idea that President Trump is skipping the networks and the newspapers, etc., and using his platform to speak directly to America. And Roosevelt did the same thing with that new medium. The name of his broadcast, I think, is really clever. He didn't call them presidential speeches, which would be boring. He called them fireside chats. So you're sitting next to the fire, listening to this friend, new president, and he was also smart enough to not do this very often so that people didn't get sick of them. But it was really smart use of a new medium. You've probably heard of the original War of the Worlds. This isn't the Tom Cruise movie. This is the original. Orson Welles, who's a very famous actor at the time, did a dramatic reading of the War of the Worlds. And this was aired in New York City. And they said at the beginning that it was a dramatic reading, but a lot of people who turned in the middle of it didn't realize it. It had some sound effects where it sounded like lasers, etc., etc. If you've heard the phrase tinfoil hat, that's where this comes from, because some people wrapped tinfoil around their heads to protect themselves from the Martians. Okay. There's been research lately that people didn't believe War of the Worlds as much as the original myth claimed, but it's fun to think about, especially in this context, because really it was the first time that Americans realized they could be fooled in the media, and we're still fooled to this day. Transistors were exciting because it meant that music could be portable. And I talked about that in the last chapter about the Sony Walkman and what a revolution that was. And it was the same with transistors. You could have your music portable. You could take it with you. So all of this is happening in AM waves. Edwin Armstrong was the first one to really push for FM waves because he said the quality was better, and he figured that FM was the future. The first FM station was at the top of the Empire State Building in New York. Edwin Armstrong's story is really kind of sad. He had a lot of legal battles with David Sarnoff. He ended up committing suicide. But he was absolutely right with FM being the future of terrestrial radio. And here's why. Let's see if I can get this down a little bit. In the middle, do you see it's amplitude modulated wave? That's AM. They're spread out. The bottom one that you can't see because the screen is cut, and I'm sorry about that, it's frequency modulated wave. Do you notice that they're closer together, but they're uniform? Okay. AM waves travel farther. FM waves are higher quality, but shorter. Does that make sense? Yeah, so if you're playing music, typically you want FM because the quality of the airwave is better. But if you're just transmitting information, or a talk show perhaps, you would choose AM. Now that brings us to KMOX here in St. Louis. KMOX is considered a clear channel radio station because it is the only station in North America that has a license to operate at AM 1120. It's a 50,000 watt clear channel station, which is why on a clear summer night, people all over North America can hear KMOX. And that's one of the reasons that the Cardinals have fans all over the country, because they have been listening to Cardinal games on KMOX because it's a clear channel. So they have a license. They are the only ones licensed to operate in AM 1120. Whereas if you go to other radio markets, there are stations that might have the same frequency as stations here in St. Louis. Okay. So radio station programming, you're probably very familiar with this. It's done in blocks, right? There's the morning drive, the afternoon drive. Those are the big, 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 valuable station blocks. I'd be curious to see if they're still as valuable, since most of us are working from home and we're not actually commuting the way we used to. It'd be interesting. Now, this is, you might be surprised, the actual top radio format is news talk. Then you've got adult contemporary. Then you have CHR, which is contemporary hit radio top 40. Country, urban, and Spanish. But news talk is the #1 format. And that usually surprises a lot of students because students your age typically don't listen to talk radio. The Telecommunications Act of '96 lifted restrictions on how many radio stations could be owned by a particular corporation. What that meant is that a company like iHeartRadio, which is now called iHeartMedia, could gobble up as many radio stations as they wanted because there was no limit. There used to be a limit to how many stations someone could own. And the Telecommunications Act got rid of that limit. So what that amounts to now is that there's really only 5 or 6 major companies that own almost every radio station in the United States. A syndicated radio show is one that is recorded in one particular location, but that program, that content is sold to radio stations around the country. So the 3 biggest syndicated talk shows or radio shows are Tom Joyner's, Rush Limbaugh's, and Ryan Seacrest. Now, Ryan, he does his morning show in Los Angeles, but he does it for an iHeartMedia station. So any other station owned by iHeartMedia can run Ryan Seacrest's show because they own that content. Syndicated radio shows are really a smart move if you are a radio station owner, because then you do not have to produce the content, and they usually come with good ratings attached. They come with their own audience. Now, how is NPR different? If you've heard of NPR, it's National Public Radio. The version of NPR in St. Louis is KWMU 90.7. NPR is different because it is funded from government fundings and donations. So they don't have to sell advertisements. Remember, the other radio stations, they exist to sell ads. That's how they make their money. NPR doesn't have to worry about that. So NPR has a very different vibe. Like KMOX in the morning is traffic and weather together every 10 minutes. Lots of commercials, lots of traffic, lots of news, lots of sports. It's very jolty, right? Because it wants to keep us from changing the channel. NPR is relaxed. They spend, gosh, I think the average length of a story on NPR is 3 or 4 minutes. So I can actually learn something. But this is the benefit of not having to worry about selling advertising space. So lost localism is a term that you want to know. And let me explain it with a story that's in your book. There was a train derailment in North Dakota, and they needed to evacuate the town that was nearby. They called the radio station to try to get the message out to people, and no one was at the radio station because the radio station was completely automated. What that means essentially is that so much of our radio that we listen to in St. Louis actually originates somewhere else. That there's very little truly local radio left, especially in the small towns. And not much regionalism either, because the iHeartMedia radio stations have the same playlists for every single genre. And so no matter what city you are in, if you are listening to an iHeartMedia radio station that happens to be the top 40 station, you're going to hear the exact same stuff that you do in Z1077 here. So there's not a lot of local flavor, local activity in radio anymore. Okay, so that's the radio chapter, and we're ending with this cute little dog. So I will see you in class.